Hello and welcome to Cinema Wellman. I am your host, David, and you can't imagine how many takes this took tonight. But today's episode is titled The Mirror Was Cracked, because we're going to take a close look at older movies and how they portrayed life as it was back in the day. The mirror is cracked because we don't always like what we see. It has been widely accepted that movies are a reflection of the society of the time in which they were made, with the exception of science fiction and fantasy where anything goes, and period pieces whose job it is to portray another time. Movies made in the 40s accurately portrayed life in the 40s. Movies made in the 50s accurately portrayed life in the 50s, and so on. We're talking about everyday life. We're not saying movies are exact replicas of the times, but what you see people doing, along with the way they talk, the words they use, and the way they dress, it gives you a glimpse into what life was like at that time. You know why you don't watch old movies and see extras walking penguins on leashes in the background as the protagonists stroll down a city street? It's because nobody was walking penguins on leashes on city streets, or anywhere for that matter. What you see in movies reflects life at the time. It's as simple as that. It can be great fun going back in the time machine and getting a glimpse of what life was like in an earlier time, but it can also be difficult to watch things that are no longer a part of our regular lives shown on the big screen because it was part of everyday life at the time that film was made. I originally intended this episode to be purely on the lighter side, but I'd be remiss if I didn't mention two things that I often seen in old movies that upset me in any context, and I'm referring to the treatment of minorities and violence towards women. I've discussed the stereotypical and hurtful portrayal of minorities in film in some previous episodes, but mostly in reference to the use of blackface. Unfortunately, blackface wasn't the only indignity suffered by people of color in the movies. They were repeatedly shown as being unintelligent, subservient, timid, and were usually used for comic relief. The problem with this comic relief is that they were there to be laughed at as opposed to being there to be laughed with. I cannot imagine how hurtful it would be to be a young person of color excited to see a movie on the big screen, and once they finally see someone like them, that character is insulting, offensive, and the butt of others' jokes. Although it's not perfect yet, cinema today is exponentially more diversified than it was 75 years ago. More and more people of color are appearing in front of and behind the camera as directors, and hopefully this continues. There are so many more valuable stories yet to be told. One more serious topic to cover before things get much lighter here, and that is violence towards women. It is alarming at how often women are seen in old movies being pushed, shoved, slapped, and even punched. A majority of this appears to be what I'd describe as casual violence. The woman is matter-of-factly struck, which suggests that it was a common occurrence. Even more alarming is how these women are portrayed as having it coming since they needed to be put in their place. Just disturbing. Oftentimes this violence occurs after the woman spurns a man who desires her. No means no, and it has always meant no. The fact that these despicable acts are often committed for the laughs is disgusting. There is absolutely nothing funny about domestic violence and violence against women in general, and it's sad to see it in so many movies of the past. Next, we're going to get a little lighter, but we're going to talk about safety issues. I grew up in the 70s, which I always thought was the decade of do whatever you want. We don't give a shit if you're safe or not. In other words, I could watch kids fall off bikes all day. If my perception of the 70s is at all accurate, then the 40s and the 50s must have been pure anarchy. It's unbelievable how kids are allowed to wander all over the village, the town, the city, wherever it is, without any parental guidance or involvement whatsoever. Kids in old movies also seem to be allowed to cavort with strangers without their parents thinking that there was anything wrong. Just met you? And you want to take my kid on an adventure with you alone? Go right ahead. Have fun. I realized that seatbelts weren't widely used in cars until the 50s, so the 40s get a pass. But it's still really bizarre to see movies of the late 50s, 60s, and even the 70s with multiple passengers riding in cars and nobody is wearing a seatbelt, not even in the picture. You have a baby? Put it in your lap or in a basket in the back seat. They'll be fine. Next up, littering and pollution. On the first Earth Day, back in April of 1971, a commercial made its television debut, and it's an ad campaign that is still talked about today. It was an anti-littering, anti-pollution, pro-environment ad that featured a Native American man, played by an Italian American man, who shed a tear when people threw trash on the highway in front of him. While it's true that there are still dirty places with a lot of trash strewn about, I honestly don't think people litter that much anymore. I remember being a young kid and visiting New York City when it was filthy and nobody seemed to care. People just walked around throwing their garbage everywhere and anywhere. I was talking with my sister Vanessa recently and told her about this episode and mentioned that I was going to talk about littering. And she told a story about Grandma Lou visiting her house many years ago when she first got married. She told me that she and Grandma Lou were talking in her garage and Grandma took out a hard candy, put the candy in her mouth, threw the wrapper on the floor, didn't think anything of it. Grandma Lou is part of a generation of litter bugs, the greatest generation. Littering must have been just a common practice back in the day where we wouldn't have seen so many characters doing it in old movies. Nowadays, if a film shows a character littering, it's probably to establish them as an asshole who hates the planet. That just wasn't the case in the movies of the past. The final crack in the mirror today is smoking. Smoking everywhere. Bars, restaurants, theaters, trains, buses, airplanes, hospitals. You got 'em? Smoke 'em. Doesn't matter where you are. Light 'em up. And pretty much every adult character seems to be smoking. The film industry later kind of decided that it needed to curb smoking, and there was a time that only bad characters smoked. Then that kind of went away as well, and now smoking is listed as one of the reasons for a film's rating. You'll see adult themes, partial nudity, graphic violence, and now smoking has joined that list. I wonder if they'll ever add littering to that list. I doubt it. Well, that is a wrap for our episode about film mirroring society and the fact that the mirror was cracked for quite a while. Some things we just won't see that much on film anymore because they aren't as widely seen in everyday life anymore. And I'm sure someone 40 years from now will have a Cinema Wellman type episode saying the same thing about movies made in the 2010s, 2020s, and 2030s. It is a mirror. We hope you join us again next week as we take a look at baby movies. Don't worry. It will come with an explanation. And until then, take care.